154 on Grand and Bridge Grand, how much of a drop that is. Those kind of down, people have done the same thing. So this is private road. I put this up as just kind of a community announcement. I understand that there's going to be a conversation next Tuesday, it's in March, about the Foxton Canyon 154 intersection. I know that's of interest to a lot of people, so I put that in as the first slide to just kind of fill time while I was getting started. So, welcome to the second State of the District. My name is Guy Savage. I'm the General Manager for the district. We've got a couple of board members here, 2 to be exact. There won't be any more here than I'm aware of, so it's just the 2. But this is really just kind of a community presentation, so you guys can ask questions in a much less formal, when you go to the board meetings, it's all about Brand Act and, got to do this, got to do that. So hopefully this is a little more relaxed, a little bit more engaged, and kind of a dialogue. I've got a full presentation that I've put together, but I'm going to be looking for some interaction from people, both as I'm going through, as well as at the end. If you want to hold your questions till then, you can. Or if you've got a question about something that I put up on a slide, please ask it then as well. In the back, I did throw some little cards and some pencils in case you want to scribble something down so you don't forget it. Feel free to grab one of those if that makes sense. So with that, I'm just going to dive in. First thing I wanted to do is just briefly share an agenda with you. So I'm going to ask you to think about what is it you want to know? What do you want to hear tonight? What's the question that's burning in your mind? And I'm going to ask for those here in just a minute, as well as try and answer them as I'm going. Many of you know how the district was formed, all that sort of stuff. I'm going to go through it again. Nothing particularly new there. It's just for those who haven't heard it before, I think it's helpful to kind of understand what we're doing and what we're up to. I'm going to be focused, this is an annual sort of a thing. As I said, this is the second one I've done. So I'll be focused pretty heavily on what's happened in 2023. If you've been following along month in, month out, won't be a whole lot new there for you. I'll also talk about what's going on right now, because we do have several things going on right now. And then I'll be kind of giving a little speculation about what the next calendar year should look like. And we'll talk about that when we get there. And then at the end, as it says here, more questions and answers. And again, I'm hoping this is going to be a little more interactive as opposed to just me talking the whole time, but I can do that as well. So, first thing I want to know is, what do you want to know? What can I make sure that I cover tonight so that you will walk out of here going, oh my gosh, I finally got the answer to... In the back.
About how many years out are we from getting sewers?
To
getting sewers.
Okay. So when will it be done? All right. What else? Oh, say Phillips.
I hesitate to throw these out, Guy, because I'm pretty sure you're going to cover them, but just kind of a refresher course on the zones and the solutions for the zones.
I can talk about that. Sorry, I've got this high-tech stand here, but it didn't work. So zones, and if you don't mind, I'll throw phases in there on that one as well. Because I think people talk about them kind of interchangeably, and sometimes that doesn't always mean the same thing.
Results from the test wells.
Test wells, okay, sure, I'll hit that. I'll be talking about wells for sure tonight. What else?
I haven't been following this very closely.
That's okay.
Do we have any estimates on costs?
That pen is free. Let me grab a different color so we can do cost estimates. Sure, I can talk about that. In fact, I plan to. One of the ones that I always get asked, what about commercial versus the non-commercial?
The donated land and what the status is of that.
So what land?
The donated land.
Donated land? Oh, okay.
Mark's land.
All right.
Mark land.
Touch on that. What else? These are great ones.
Well, we're going to hear the different options with the pros and cons.
Options, pros and cons. Okay. What else? That's a pretty good list to get started.
Restrooms.
Restrooms. There's one right here. Yeah, restrooms. All right. Any other ones you want up here before I dive in? Ken's going there forever. All right, well, I'll try and hit on those as well as hopefully the other ones that you didn't ask, and we'll go from there. All right, so as I said, I wanted to start with an overview of the district itself, very briefly, right? Most of us know we were designated as a special problems area back in 1974, right? Almost 50 years ago. Yeah, 50 years ago next year. I will talk about the special problems area versus the district, because there is a difference, right? Make sure you understand that. 2018, local voters voted to form a district, and of those that voted, 73% said, let's form a district, right? The whole focus as part of that was, let's make sure we ensure local control. Don't forget, there was conversations about the county hooking us to someone else, somewhere else, you know, that sort of thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Ultimately, if we, the district, are unable to build a sewer or get something that functions for our nitrate issues, the county could step in, right, and say, okay, now it's back to us. I don't think anybody wants that. I know I certainly don't. And so for us, and the way I like to view it is, doing nothing is not an option. We have to do something. Now we just have to decide and agree on what that something is. All right, so the district itself, this blue on this slide shows the district boundaries. Kind of keep that in your mind. You'll see a slide when I talk in particular about the wells that shows how much bigger the special problems area is. Particularly, it goes well above Highway 154, and it goes further to the east or the right on this picture. Current count is 378 parcels. That number does fluctuate, just so you're clear, because people will join two parcels together to make a single property. For instance, with what just happened at Maddie's, I think 6 of them were combined into one. I forget the exact numbers. Currently, we're tracking roughly 44 commercial and the rest being residential. The reason I'm saying roughly is, I think we all know this, but there are a number of commercially zoned properties that are used residentially, right? So over time, presumably those may end up being used commercially. And then our annual budget is about $250,000, right? Not a lot of money when you think about, if you've been following along, our estimate for a gravity-fed sewer, kind of the all-in, was about $50 million, right? So when you look at $250,000 compared to 50, you know, you've got a big gap there. So we'll talk about how that might come to play and how that might all work out as we move forward. So what is it that we're trying to do, right? Ultimately, we're trying to put in a wastewater processing plant and system, right? And it really just has 3 components. Now, there are lots of different ways you can do this stuff, right? We'll talk about at least a few of them. But it really comes down to collection, treatment, and disposal, right? So you collect this stuff from your house, you take it someplace, maybe it's on your property, maybe it's somewhere else. You treat it, in our case, to remove nitrates. That's the key for us. And then once you've treated it, you put that treated water somewhere, you dispose of it. Now, we had a great conversation, I'll be talking about this more in a few minutes, back early this year, about how the community would like to see us dispose of the wastewater when we get to disposal. But again, importantly for us, it's about nitrates in our water, right? And I'll show you some real numbers on that, some of the test wells and some of that conversation in a few slides. So, we good so far? All right, terrific. All right, so this is not an exhaustive list of everything that happened in 2023, right? 12 months, 12 meetings, maybe a few more meetings if you count subcommittees and such. But I think it was pretty good progress for the year. Early in the year, we had 2 workshops, and I think were very informative for those that attended them. We held a community workshop. Both of these were over at St. Mark's. Held a community workshop where we talked about these different options, about what's important to community members, about where we might go, that sort of stuff. And then both County Santa Barbara Environmental Health Services, as well as the Regional Water Quality Control Board, not the guys that give us our drinking water, the guys that regulate us from a wastewater perspective, came and gave us a little presentation. There was a good workshop on how that all fits together from their perspective, some of the things they're thinking about when they look at a potential wastewater system. So it was very informative, those 2 meetings. Shortly after that, we began a technical review, and I'm going to talk in more detail about most of these We began a technical review with an organization called Regen, who kind of looked at where we're at and kind of sliced and diced and gave us what we termed a rubric, kind of a decision-making tool to help us understand what might be the direction we want to go or what we might want to study next, and we're going to talk some more about that. We got a LAFCO extension. LAFCO, for those who don't know, LAFCO is a county organization, essentially, that they're the ones that we get our, in quotes here, powers from, meaning we have powers to implement a wastewater system, right? We don't have powers to provide police services. We don't have powers to provide fire services. Any of those. We have wastewater. That's it. And so, as we're going through this process, trying to get to a design and ultimately build a wastewater treatment system, we'll be going back to them occasionally to say, here's where we're at, here's what we need to do. In fact, as part of that extension, they now ask for us to give them a quarterly report. It's a shorter version of what you guys get from me via email. You got one presumably last month, because they don't care about some of the background, right? They just want to know what have we done, what are we doing next? A much shorter kind of discussion. So those top three are kind of done, and then there's two down here at the bottom that are underway. This speaks to some of the questions about 30% design and 60% design and 10% design, all that sort of stuff. We've re-engaged Regen to do some additional engineering for us, and I'll talk in detail about what that really looks like. But that is underway. Probably in January, maybe in February, we'll get halfway through that contract. It's a 6-month contract, and Regen will be back at one of our board meetings to say, okay, I've made it this far to what we've been loosely calling the 15%, halfway through their work. What do you want me to really dig into at this point? So that'll be a decision the board will make. Again, probably January or February. I'm hoping January, may slide it to February. The sooner the better, in my opinion. And then this whole conversation about groundwater monitoring wells, about what we've done, what we're going to do. I heard today from the county, it looks like our grant application is approved, so we'll be moving forward pretty quickly with those. As I told the county, if that is in fact what they're telling me that it is approved, it didn't say you're approved, but he was like, when are you going to be done? I'm like, well, you got to approve our grant before we get started. So he was asking the when are you going to be done questions, and I said, well, if you're telling me we're approved, we should be drilling holes in the ground in January. Maybe early February, but most likely January. So again, not an exhaustive list, but I picked kind of the highlights of what happened this last year or what we're up to right now. So let me dive into the earlier workshop. So the workshop, we had a great facilitator that came from Santa Barbara and helped us kind of walk through and talk through all of these different issues that were on people's minds. We had people go around, and many of you have been part of kind of the sticky sort of an exercise where you prioritize what's important to you. And based on that input, as well as we had a few people, I put a survey online so people could go online and say, well, I missed the meeting, but here's what's important to me. So we kind of put all that together in just simple, more people said what's listed as number 1 here than what's listed as number 10. So at the top here, you can see that the highest priority for people when the board is making decisions is to think about cost, right? I think that probably matches with what most of us would say. The next one they were focused on was this question of ownership and maintenance. So this was really about the whole conversation we're still having a little bit about if we go, for instance, with an effluent sewer, we often refer to that as STEP, and I'll talk some more about what that means. But if we do something other than the standard kind of gravity-fed sewer, who owns what, right? Does that mean the district needs to come onto my property? Do I own everything? So we'll be talking about that at a future board meeting, but that was important to people. Where's the plant going to go? We don't have a plant location currently, and while there's been discussion about different parcels, the district doesn't own any land, okay? So we have kind of first right of refusal for a little parcel there by the church from the county, but that's it. There's no other land in our back pocket anywhere. So who knows where it would go. Growth inducement, a lot of concern about the San Ynez Valley plan. If you haven't seen it, there's a link to it on our website. But just, depending on how we do this, how much will a sewer plant induce growth in our community? And I think that's a fair concern. I know I look often at, for instance, San Ynez and Solvay. I chose to live in Los Olivos because I like it better here. But they both have sewers, so while I agree that, personally I agree that, yeah, we'll see some changes because people have maybe a little bit of pent-up demand to do some things. I don't know that personally it's going to be like explosive growth, but we'll see. But that was a concern of people's, and I think a good one. Odors was next. You know, I think we're all, you know, you're talking about sewage. Odors are always a concern. I will share, Tom Fairham and I, the president, went and visited Avila Beach, who put in a system like the one we've historically been talking about, a membrane bioreactor or MBR system. And I stood this close to it and couldn't smell it. So that's kind of encouraging. I don't know that that means there's no odors, but again, I was that close to it and couldn't smell a thing, and it was literally bubbling right in front of me. Treatment plant footprint and size. So I think we're all very concerned. You know, we don't want to see something massive in our community. So that was one of the next one down. Viewshed impact. This was really about, you know, people don't want to see big ponds. They don't want to see a massive sewer plant, you know, right in the middle of town, sort of thing. Again, a good concern. The use of innovation. Are there some more innovative techniques that we could be using? You know, the wastewater treatment environment has shifted. You know, although we've been doing this for thousands of years, right? There are some new technologies out there that might make things a little better for us. In fact, some of what we've been talking about with advanced on-site systems is actually relatively new. Just the processes we're using, that sort of stuff. And then there was a smattering of other things that were captured and we'll keep kind of on our radar, but we're much lower down the list. The other thing that was discussed at that meeting, and I think this is important because remember I talked about it's collection, treatment, and disposal. We had a great conversation about disposal. We had just finished a year ago this month getting a report done from a couple of hydrologists about, you know, here's the things you can do with the water when you're done, the disposal. And we asked them to look at these 5 things, which are kind of the 5 that are available to us. So percolation chambers. A percolation chamber, think of a kind of like your leach line, right? But much larger, where you put something underground and dispose of water in that way. So it puts it back into our local groundwater table. Percolation ponds, this is often what you see at very large sites, right? Where you just got a big pond out there, and when they're done treating the water, they put it into a pond, it either evaporates or goes into the ground. Injection wells, we looked, in fact, if you go back through the documents, particularly from early on when the district was being formed, there's a lot of focus on injection wells because they don't take up much space, right? You've got a well, you drill a hole down in the ground, and you kind of inject the water back down into the water table with that. Great thought from a space perspective, but extremely expensive because you basically have to treat the water to full drinking quality levels. Not quite, but it's close before you inject it. So it means a lot more on the treatment side. So we haven't discarded it, but it does mean that we'll have a lot more to do in order to inject things. Creek disposal, you know, the thought was there are communities that do this, right? They either send it out into the ocean or into a creek or some other existing waterway. As soon as you start talking about creeks, you're dealing with the federal government as well. Lots of potential penalties. So the hydrologist kind of said, you probably don't want to get anywhere near that one. Based on what I read from their report, I would tend to agree. And then the 5th one was reuse. You know, how can we reuse the water? And the hydrologists, I think, were smart. They said, you know, don't treat this one as a 5th alternative. Instead, think of it as 4 alternatives with reuse as a possibility pretty much with any of them. And that's the appropriate way to think about it. So what the community said at that meeting was this order. So look first at percolation chambers with reuse, and then at percolation ponds with reuse. And by the time we got to 3 and 4, people were like, not so sure that's where we want to go. So that, it's not a done decision, but that is the closest, I think, to a decision that we have in collection, treatment, or disposal. Because, you know, chambers were relatively cost effective, which was number 1 and 2 on our list prior. And that seems to be where the community wants to go. So there'll be more conversation about it, but if I were to say, you know, anything is close to a decision that may be made, it's this one, but even that hasn't been officially made. So before I move from this workshop, any questions on that stuff? Lisa?
So just on the chambers and the lines, that's cost effective from a construction standpoint and operations and maintenance?
Yep.
Not just capital?
Yep, I'll show you those actual numbers in, I don't know, few slides, but yeah. Yeah.
But don't we need to know how much is being collected and
We have
has to
estimates
be
on what's
treated
being
in
collected,
order,
yeah.
because won't that affect the cost effectiveness of the various alternatives?
Yes, to a certain level, it certainly will. Yeah, absolutely. If I could paraphrase, right, in case not everybody who's online can hear you.
Oh,
So, point is, or the question was, don't we have to know how much we're going to collect and treat and then dispose, right? Yes, certainly. If we, for instance, only did the commercial core first, chambers would be one size. If we do the whole community at once, which I don't think anybody's saying we will, they would be a different size, right? Ultimately, though, this is an interesting problem for the board and for the community, and that is that the regulators are saying, look, you can implement the commercial core first if you'd like, but you have to have a plan for the entire district. Doesn't mean you have to implement it right away, right? But you have to have a plan for the entire district. If we were only going to ever do the commercial core, the district would have been the commercial core, right? But no, we've got a huge chunk of the special problems area. So yes, certainly, whether it's collection, treatment, or disposal, depending upon how we're going to phase things, and we'll talk again about phasing and zoning, that definitely does make a difference, for sure. Now, I will tell you, and we heard from the regulators just last month, a lot of the funds that have been available to do construction and other things are actually being pulled back at the state and federal level, except for in one area, and that's for people who want to do reuse. There's still a lot of funds to be able to do reuse, so we're still pretty focused on how can we leverage funds that we can get to be able to do reuse into treatment and other things, right? Because if you're going to reuse water, it has to be treated to a certain level, so therefore you can often say, okay, well, help us with the treatment costs as well. So we're looking at all of that. Yes?
What did Maddox do?
What did Maddox do? Maddox built their own system. They have it, it's kind of there on the side street, and their reuse is they use it for their garden and their landscaping there. So they are a standalone system, and we'll talk about what that means to us further down the line. But hold that thought. If I don't answer the question that you may be still asking, please stop me and ask me.
Okay.
All right. So then we had this Environmental Health Services (EHS) Water Board workshop, and from my perspective, there are two real big takeaways. The whole cost of an on-site wastewater treatment system, OWTS, or what we often refer to as advanced on-site. They gave us costs for that. So for a residential, let me be really clear, this is not commercial, right? This is residential side. Capital construction is somewhere in the $30,000 to $70,000 range, although I was at an event Friday night and somebody told me their estimate was $100,000 for a residence. I'm going to stick with their numbers for now, but we'll have to verify what that might look like. All that's depending on different things like site conditions and components required. And then annual maintenance on those is somewhere in the $1,500 to $1,900 range. And that includes, as a homeowner, if you have an on-site system, you're responsible for regular pumping and permits and service contracts and everything else. And for those who have them, and we have several of them in the community now, I think if you talk to anybody who owns one, they will tell you the responsibility of a homeowner is much greater than what many of us, how we treat our septic tanks, right? We don't have to get an annual permit. We don't have to, have a service contract. We're supposed to get it pumped every 3 to 5 years. Most people in the community, I would argue, probably don't do that. There are many that do, but most, I suspect, don't. Once you've got an advanced on-site system, you're required to. You don't have a choice, right? So that's how they came up with those numbers. So that was one set of really good information from EHS and the Water Board. The other one was this conversation that, quite honestly, was outside my understanding at first. There have been some changes in the law about when you have a tank like a septic tank, or if you use an advanced on-site system, or if we use a step system, that tank has to be away from the water line, our fresh drinking water line. Not the little one that just runs to your house, but the main that runs down the street. Has to be 25 feet away. That's important when we start thinking about design of things, right? Particularly if we look at effluent sewers or step, because we have some really small lots that what is often referred to as an existing non-conforming implementation of a septic tank, meaning their house ends here, their septic tank's here, and the road is where you guys are at, and that's where the water line is. Because it's already in place and the law changed, they're allowed to keep that tank. If they have to change that tank, or if they were to go to, for instance, an effluent sewer, they couldn't put a tank right here. So Some of those lots, there's no room anywhere else to put a tank. So we're either gonna have to get really creative with how they put together a tank if we go down that effluent sewer approach, or come up with another approach. So it might be that for homes like those, there's no choice but gravity. And that's part of what Regen's looking at with this current contract. So speaking of Regen, this is the early 2023 technical review and rubric. They ultimately had this great big spreadsheet. You can look at it. It's online if you want to see that took those 10 sort of priorities that I showed you from the community meeting and put them into groups like, personal kind of impacts, community impacts, those sorts of things, and then weighted them to come up with this prioritization of things as far as things that we might want to continue to look at or consider looking at in the future. Now, some of this stuff we already have data for, right? But not all of it. So right now, and I'll show you this in a minute, but these top three, and particularly this third one, and I'll talk about how we came to that third one on the next couple of slides, but those top three is kind of what we hired Regen to look at, but primarily that third one. So how did we come up with hybrid distributed? So this is kind of I realize I'm getting a little bit down into the weeds here, but I think it's important for people to understand how we got there, because it helps you understand where we might go next and helps you engage in the conversation. So one of the first things we did is we looked, here's the district, right? And we looked at parcel sizes. I mentioned a minute ago, we've got a number of parcels, particularly smaller residential ones, but also some commercial ones that the building or the structure pretty much takes up the whole lot. So we looked at that and said, all these little red ones, those are less than 1/4 of an acre. The green ones being less than 1/2 acre, purple less than 3/4, and everybody else is above that. But when you look at the clusters, particularly of those red ones, you start saying, well, I see some commonalities here, right? Like as I go down San Marcos, particularly the upper half of San Marcos Avenue there, a lot of small homes. We know where the commercial core is. It's kind of outlined there in red. So you begin to say, oh, well, there's some commonalities here. Let's think about those as groups, right? And then we know we've got a creek that kind of runs, you can kind of see it along there. So we've got things that are on the west side of the creek and things that are on the east side of the creek. Maybe we need to think about those. We know we've got larger lots on the southwestern side and toward the south of the district. So, all of those sort of makeups of lot sizes in particular began to influence a design that the technical subcommittee put together. And we called it a hybrid approach. Now, this one just shows it in 3 colors because I think it's in some ways easier to see it in 3 colors, because what it shows is the hybrid approach the technical committee put together and handed to Regen as a starting point. I'll talk about that in a second. The blue here are what we refer to as zones 1 and 2. So zone 1 being the commercial core and some of those small lots. Zone 2 basically being along the right-hand side of this. That area of our community was at least initially targeted, and nothing magical about that targeting, other than those lot sizes, right, and some of those other commonalities, for gravity-fed sewers. Zone 3, which kind of is cut off at Alamo Pintado there, Zone 4 and Zone 5, which is kind of this bottom piece down here, those were targeted for effluent sewers. So that would mean that you just have a much smaller line, but you'd have a tank still on your property if you lived in one of those, if we implemented this. There's nobody saying we're going to. And then all of the stuff in green was targeted at least for one full go-round of an on-site wastewater treatment system or an advanced on-site system. So those folks in green would kind of be they'd replace their septic tank with an advanced on-site system. Importantly, and I think this was to your question a little bit, Maddie's Tavern and the school, we said, we're going to treat those different because they're very unique parcels. Maddie's Tavern, of course, is now a fully functioning hotel. They have their own system. They are required when we build a sewer to join our sewer by their permit requirements. So they basically have a system like the one we've been talking about. It's kind of like an MBR that takes all their waste, treats it, again, disposes of it right there on the site. We also know Los Olivos School's a little unique, right? Much larger parcel, lots of kids there during the day, nothing at night, right? And it's mostly toilets, right? They have some water, but it's mostly toilets. There's nobody Well, maybe there are a few showers there. I don't know if there's a shower there or not. But it's not like they're people regularly getting ready for work, that sort of stuff there. So they're unique, and they've got all that land, right? So there might be some way we can do something that makes sense both for the community as well as Los Olivos School. So you can see that's kind of the hybrid approach that was put together by the technical committee and handed off to Regen. Now, importantly, Regen is going to start with this, but one of their first tasks is to look at that. They're professional wastewater people, right? Is to look at this and say, you know, that doesn't make sense. You guys should, I'm making it up, you know, carve off just the commercial core as gravity fed and put everybody else on effluent. And one of the things we've asked them to do is look at if we were to maximize an effluent sewer. And an effluent sewer is one, again, you've got a tank on your parcel that the initial separation happens, and then the effluent goes to a treatment plant as opposed to going into the ground and be treated right on your parcel. So it goes somewhere else and we remove the nitrates and all that sort of stuff. So Regen's gonna look at maximizing an effluent sewer approach over the district. Now, I don't know if I said it, but I want to be clear if I didn't. While we said advanced onsite for Zone 6, that's not a forever thing, right? Eventually, even the folks in Zone 6, in Zone 6 would eventually have to come on to a community sewer. And you can kind of see some of the breakdown here, but that's kind of where we started. Now again, nobody says this is how it's going to happen, right? It was just a starting point after we looked at things like parcel sizes. So questions on this stuff?
What does disposal typically look like in advanced onsite?
What does disposal look like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a septic? You have a leach field?
Pretty close, yeah. The treatment is a lot more intense, right? You've got filters and blowers and electricity, and it's not just run it into a tank.
Has to meet a
let
higher
it settle
standard.
and let it go away.
So,
But yeah, you tend to have something that looks like your existing leach
so no
field.
trenching to a line in the street.
Yeah.
Gravity.
But for those people where their water is not going down, that's really not gonna help them. It's gonna clean up the water.
Yeah.
But it's still not gonna
Yeah,
drain.
it's got to be able to percolate, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, so if their water is not percolating down, then yeah, same problem exists. And you know, that's part of what we need to look at to make sure that that'll work.
I've never heard the board mention, but for all the people that would potentially stay on advanced onsite, would the board be considering doing some kind of like bulk purchasing or helping those people with the cost of replacing their advanced onsite when the time comes for that to happen for those folks? Like, it seems like you should have some, enhanced bargaining power maybe that the board could, the district could exercise.
Yeah, for sure. So, in case people couldn't hear that, so for the folks in Zone 6 or anybody that might be going on to advanced onsite or onsite wastewater treatment systems, the board has had conversations, albeit brief, about, maybe there is an opportunity, that's, by this count, it's 74 parcels. If you had to buy, we probably wouldn't buy 74 of them, but, if you bought 50 of them at once or hired a contractor to kind of, start up here and work your way down or whatever makes sense, there could be some significant cost savings. One of the struggles with that is anybody who's been in the construction industry knows, what the person who owns, and I'm just picking them out, this parcel wants might be pretty different from what that parcel wants and needs. So one person might need a 2,000 gallon tank, another person a 4,000. So it could be very involved, but I think that's a reasonable thing that the board would look at when we get to that point, for sure.
Follow that question up. Will those people have a choice? Maybe some of them would say, you know what, I don't want to deal with advanced on-site system. Can we just hook into the affluent sewer system?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I'd like to say personally it'd be great if we could run a line, but if you're going to run a line, well then they're going to be expected to connect right then and there. So remember that, I think it was number 4, that whole maintenance ownership priority question. You're right on the top of it right here. If I have an on-site wastewater treatment system, ownership is mine, maintenance is mine. I'd rather have a gravity sewer, maybe somebody would say, right? So I don't have to mess with it. I just flush the toilet and it goes away, and I read a check every month. So yeah, that's part of the conversation, and I think when we get into, and I'll talk later about what I expect to see in 2024. When we get into 2024, I think that's part of the conversation that needs to be had. You might have people, you know, I'll just use this as an example, you know, if you assume that that dashed line goes down the middle of zone 2 there, you might have people on zone 2 that say, well, I want to be on effluent sewer, I don't want to be on gravity, you know. Ultimately, we're going to have to come to a decision and be looking for everybody in the room and those that aren't here today to weigh in and help make that decision. Please.
Yeah, this might be very naive on my part, but okay, what happens with people wherever they are and a decision is made and they don't have the money to do it? I mean, there's people in this community.
Yeah, for sure,
myself included,
Yeah.
that don't have the $2,000.
Right. Yeah, well,
What
so
happens
for
to
those
those
online,
people?
yeah,
We
what
just
do you
sell
do with
and
somebody
have to
who,
move, or
yeah,
what?
for somebody who can't basically afford what they're gonna have to do now? This goes down 5 or 6 different rows. I'll try and keep it fairly narrow here. But one of the things that you've got to look at is, well, what happens if their septic tank fails today? They have to do something, or they could get red tag. Red tag meaning booted out of your house. Nobody wants that. So there is this question of, well, what would happen today? Now, the beauty of a centralized sewer managed and owned by a district like ours is, first of all, we'll be able to get loans. Now, there are loans for people who have financial hardship, you know, different types of hardships, to be able to get to replace their septic system if they had to. Presumably, there would be some of those same sorts of loans for an implementation of whatever. But at some point, yeah, if we're going to do this, you're going to have to do something regardless of who you are. Now, there are different ways to do that, right? I would anticipate, based on my experience in other communities, you know, it's not a I need $70,000 today, right? As a district, we can take out a loan for a very long time at much lower rates generally than an individual can get. So it might be on your property tax bill for the next 40 years. Or we might come to some decision that says, hey, you're going to pay X amount until the property sells or changes hands. And then you have to, you know, there are lots of different models for financing. None of those decisions have been made yet. We're still trying to gather costs and decide, well, here's what it's going to cost. And then we can talk about it. Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting push and pull because, kind of to the point here, some people, we have at least one business in town whose septic tanks is basically failing today. They don't have a solution right now, right? We're not going to be able to give them a solution right now. But there's going to be, the further along we go, the more kind of folks in that sort of a problem. So the good news on that is EHS, who's county EHS, is the regulator who you go to get your septic tank pumped, and when you pump it, they look at the report and everything. They're still working with us to kind of not bring down the heavy hammer to say, oh, you know, yours failed, you've got to replace it. They're still kind of saying, well, you know, we see that you've got this potential solution on the horizon, so we'll give you more time. If we don't have a potential solution on the horizon, they may get much more strict on the existing septic tanks. Before the district was formed, those of us who were in the community then know that there was discussion then about required reporting of septic tank pumping from every resident. And I was glad to see the district formed just so we didn't have to deal with the overhead of that, right? So, yeah, lots of conversation to be had. No answers, unfortunately, at this point, but I can assure you of one thing, and that is people recognize, because we all know somebody, right, who's just living off Social Security and maybe a small pension, right, or no pension and their small 401k and Social Security in our community, particularly people who've been here for a little while. So entirely possible that we'll have to come up with a special approach for people like that. Other questions on this one?
I'm sorry, you have those numbers for the advanced on-site, like 30 to 100,000. I know that's a huge span. The slide
30
you
to
had,
70,000, yeah.
yeah, whatever it was, 30 to 70.
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding is with the gravity system, if it were that blue wherever it goes, would be the system, the collection and treatment and disposal would be financed through the assessment that everybody would pay. But in addition to that, the landowner, property owner has to pay to have the lateral to actually get connected into that gravity system. That's separate from that, so that's just out of pocket. And how much is that? Is that comparable? Is that potentially comparable to the $30,000?
Kind of 3 or 4 things there. So the question really is, how much is a lateral, right?
Yeah, on top of
yeah. So
what
if
you're
you're
paying
a
for the
gravity
gravity
fed,
system.
we've not done any estimating on that, and the reason for that is, you know, you look
It
at this
can
building,
vary
I don't know
widely.
where the pipe comes out of this building and goes to the septic tank, presumably out the back.
Yeah, I don't know.
But who knows, right? They've got a side yard here. So, you know, some tanks, existing tanks, the feed comes, like at my house, it comes off the side, and it's pretty straight shot to the street. It came out the back of my house, and I had to go all the way around the back, you know, underneath concrete or something else. It's gonna be a much different cost. I have a gravel driveway, easy to terrace.
Yeah.
It has concrete,
No,
so,
I was just thinking, like, for people trying to begin to do apples to
sure.
apples, it's hard because
it really is,
those
yeah.
numbers are,
I will say, you know, this is one of the things we found out with effluent sewers, and I'll come to your question, about effluent sewers. Of course, with gravity fed, you have to worry about gravity, drop, and fall, right? Because things have to flow by gravity. One of the advantages of effluent sewers is it's under pressure. And it doesn't have to be buried quite so deep, right? Means you have to have a pressure source on your property, but, you know, probably easier to drill laterally at 3 or 4 feet down. It has to be below the frost zone. We have a real frost zone here, but it has to be below the frost zone, and then you can run it. And that includes the mains as well, right? You don't have to, the original Stantec report, I think, had some properties toward the south of the district down in here, 25 feet down to get the proper gravity fall. At least from a construction perspective, effluent, just 4 feet down, I guess that's probably about 4 feet, you know, pushing it through without any issues. Over here and then I'll go here.
So you alluded to the advanced on-site degree being kind of quote temporary because it might eventually have to go into a community system.
Mm-hmm.
The effluent system is considered a community system in this situation. So 2 kind of questions. 1, what is the lifespan of an effluent system?
Yep.
Do we know? And then 2, who pays for the initial installation of the effluent?
Yeah, so let me answer those and maybe some others that were kind of hinted at in there. So an effluent sewer, this question of who owns the tank that's on an individual parcel goes back to that priority number 4. That decision has not been made. Some property owners would say, no, I want the district to own it because they can take care of the maintenance and everything else. Others say, no, I don't want anybody on my property. I want to own it. So we're going to have to come through that discussion. An effluent sewer is considered a community system, and the reason for that is, again, you have a tank, out of your house comes the effluent, right? Goes into a tank, and that initial settling happens right there. And then all of the liquid gets shipped somewhere else for treatment. And so that's why it's a community system, because we're treating it somewhere else, and we're disposing of it centrally. Now, it could be that that's a couple of plants, but just think of it as one, because that's easier conceptually, right? You know, that's why it's considered a community system. Whereas on-site wastewater treatment, everything, collection, treatment, and disposal happens on-site. You had another question, Steve.
Yeah, so how, do we know enough experience with those, how long they last?
Oh,
or do you have to be replacing some of that infrastructure?
Effluent sewers or
Yes,
all?
effluents.
Yeah, okay, so effluent sewers, the tanks, we had the guys from Arenco out, and they drug out a tank and showed it to us. 50, 60, 70 years, that tank lasts. It's a heavy-duty polyurethane kind of thing. There are motors in them, right, because you got to have that pump pressure that don't last that long, right? I don't know any motors that last 40 or 50 years, but they tend to be, you know, lifted out, put in a new one, and off you go. The pressurized lines, pretty much everything, whether you're using gravity-fed or pressurized via an effluent sewer, they're all some form of PVC kind of a thing these days. They don't really do big concrete in a community like ours anymore. They tend to be some sort of a PVC type material, which, you know, short of some sort of shaking or something smashing it, it lasts a long time. We've been looking at that. I think that's a great question, though, because we've been looking at how long do these various components last, right? Like, how long does an MBR system last if you buy one? Well, one of the things we were looking at is those last maybe 50 years, right? It's mostly stainless steel, but there are components that will have to be replaced more often than that, and there's filters and stuff. But, you know, the base system, maybe it lasts 50 years. An on-site wastewater treatment system, again, putting aside the consumables, probably more in the 30 to 40 years, what we're told. So, does that answer the?
Yes.
Okay, if not, I'll come back. Yes, please. No.
So, I'm in the green zone,
Okay.
which I thought was nice, but not apparently. I did look at how having one of these systems put on my property, which is 3.5 acres. It is more than $70,000. And if I have to put one of those in, and then 3 years later you come down and tell me I have to hook into the sewer system, I'm gonna be a little upset.
Yeah, understood, totally, and that's why it's kind of back to the question that was asked over there. We've got to make sure we have a solid plan, right, up front, so that people don't spend.
It may not matter how long it lasts, but you're not gonna say, okay, now we're gonna put this out of the bid.
Yeah, for sure, you know, I think there's a question about, well, what if, you asked the question about, well, what if, I don't know which one's you, but I'll say this is you. What if that person wants to just connect, you know, they're not that far from that effluent sewer, can't I just do that now? You know, if we get to that sort of a conversation and there's a big gathering of folks, for instance, down here, or a majority down here that say, I'd rather just do effluent now, I'm sure that'll influence what we put to a Prop 218 vote, right? Because we'll say, well, maybe this red should just cover that side. I don't know what the answer is to that. We'll probably be talking about a lot of that this next calendar year, with the lead up toward presumably a Prop 218 in 25. I've got it up on the slide in a minute. So you're asking the right question, and I'm right there with you, because I think that's one of the struggles when you talk about different approaches in a district like this. It's much easier in some ways to just say, well, everybody's going to be on gravity, or everybody's going to be on effluent, or everybody's going to just be advanced onsite. Then you know where you're at and where you're headed. So we'll have to talk about the timing and how that might look, for sure.
Theoretical question.
Yeah.
Given the well testing of nitrites, is there any possibility that the scope of the special problem area get changed?
That's a great question. I've asked this a little differently. Can I hold that until I get to the wells? And I'll make sure I answer that then.
Well, she's just done like 3/4 of one of my questions,
Good.
so that's great, because I'm also in 6.
Yeah.
It also screams for, how about they agree that 6 doesn't have to do, you know, a step A required to a step B. I mean, that's another way to go about it, even if we're still within special, you know, the special needs district. Even if we're still in that special problems area, there also would seem to be some sort of appeal process that says, well, wait a second, we know the bigger parcels aren't as big of a problem as the lower level. I remember that from one of the very first meetings the board ever had. The commercial, the smaller lots, more dense, more difficult,
Yep.
older, failing. So theoretically, 6 isn't contributing as much to the nitrate problem as the more concentrated our areas are.
Yep.
And therefore, if you take care of those first, can't we then be later, when you're ready, to hook right in without doing this intermediary cost and expense? Because there's a logic to that doesn't make a lot of sense.
This then speaks, if I could,
Yeah,
this then
please.
speaks a little bit to timing, which is kind of a phasing question as opposed to zones, right? Nobody's saying that all of this is going to happen at once, right? In fact, as I think I mentioned earlier, the first step for the initial implementation might just be the commercial zone. We don't know yet, right? More likely it's going to include the smaller lots of some level, just because we know that there's some concentrations there. We're going to learn some more about that here very soon. It might be that the rest of the plan is much longer out, right? Again, nothing magical about these zones. Those boundaries could and will shift. They will shift. I don't know how they'll shift, but they will shift. And it doesn't speak to when, right? It speaks to, here's some areas that have commonalities. They're larger lots. They're better candidates, particularly on the west side of the creek here, for advanced on-site wastewater treatment systems. The ones up in the upper right, we know already from our one well, high nitrate concentrations. So as we get more wells, we'll get more data. And that'll help us
I know
decide.
you're going to go to that too. But my other question really was, Guy, have you been near an affluent system, a modern day affluent system? Are they noisy? Is there noise to them? We're talking about motors and we're talking about pressure. Are they loud?
So the one that I was at in Avila is not quiet. The cars going down the street, I live on Grand, the cars going down Grand are often louder than what I was hearing there. But it's not, there is a hum for sure. You've got mechanical stuff operating, right? Now, there are ways you can deal with that. You can put it inside a barn kind of a structure, muffles and all that sort of stuff that I think would be pretty effective. It wasn't like, I'm probably talking louder now just because there's people in the room here. than I was to the operator who was about where that chair is.
I'm thinking about location on a residential.
For sure.
You know,
Yeah, for sure.
an individual residential, and therefore, can you time it so that it doesn't happen at night when you're sleeping, for example? Fun things like that. Are there solutions to that? I just wondered if you'd had personal experience around that.
Yeah, so I don't have experience with trying to time those things. I know that the way treatment plants work is you basically, they're bugs in a treatment plant, right? Little microbes that want to be fed all the time. And that's the goal, is just kind of keep them in this happy range where they're getting enough food. So that implies that yes, it can go up and down, but you're not going to shut it off for 6 or 8 hours. You might tone it down. But think about what we've got going on in the community too, right? I mean, most of us are asleep kind of, I'll call it 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. That's a good 8-hour window. Most of us are asleep then. So our toilet use, our shower use, restaurant use, hotel, all of that drops. So I don't know I'm not an operator.
She was asking about the step tank on your property. Is
I
that what
was.
you were
Oh,
trying to
you're
ask
asking
about?
about I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I completely thank you.
Isn't that the effluent? Am I crazy?
No, he was talking about a treatment
I was
plant,
talking
like an
about
MBR
that.
treatment
No.
plant.
Yeah, so let me answer that question. Thank you for clarifying. So yes, with a step tank, those are not pumping all the time. In fact, you're probably minutes in a day, not hours in a day, that something on your parcel would be pumping. And if it's longer than that, it's probably not even every day, right? With an effluent pump. Because you've got a 2,000-gallon tank, right? And it will hopefully never get completely full, because that means you've got something else going on. But you're constantly pushing liquid out, right? And you're going to have some 378 parcels that are, if we all had effluent, that need to push into that pipe. So there's a timing thing there.
But at some point too, you may want to know on those 6 parcels, how new is your septic tank, and what kind of shape is it in,
Sure.
and all that kind of stuff, because that may have a factor.
So that's an interesting point. We asked the county for that data. The county does not have it for every parcel. When the septic tank was installed, when it was last maintained, they have when it was last tested, kind of thing. But they don't have, for instance, my house is reasonably new, built in the 80s. They didn't know how big my tank was. They didn't know when it was installed, and I told them. So,
Is there somebody online? Are there online questions?
this is
Oh, okay,
webinar style.
okay.
Okay, so let me push forward here. One more question, somebody?
I did. but-
Sure, go ahead.
And you can tell me to put a pin in it if this isn't the appropriate time to ask this, that's okay.
Go ahead.
But one of my biggest questions is if we move out of being a special problems district, which I don't know what that means in terms of if 1 and 2 are, then all of a sudden we're all out of it, or it has to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Right.
I don't know how far it has to go where all of a sudden they release us from being a special problems district. But one of the lovely things about being in this district is the growth issue, and if we're out of special problems, we fall under SB 9, which is for the whole state.
Right.
Which then gets into the smaller lots of 4 or 5, 3, 4, 5.
Yep.
What if they all of a sudden start subdividing and doing the 1,200, and now all of a sudden you've got 2 to 3 times the homes, et cetera,
For sure.
on those lots. And then all of a sudden so again, I don't know that this is the right place to ask that question, but I think everyone keeps focusing on the commercial district in terms of growth. It's more all of a sudden 3, 4, and 5 could have 2 and 3 and God knows how many homes on them.
So for those who aren't familiar, basically referring to lot splits and ADU additions on parcels. So accessory dwelling unit, ADU. If we have a sewer, people presumably would be a little more free to add an ADU, right? Is ultimately what you're saying. We've got a plan for that.
But it's
but
more
we
than
don't-
ADUs, it's not just ADUs.
No, I understand. You
Okay.
do some lot splits as well.
Right,
And other
but
things,
you
but-
can split, as long as the lot is 1,200 square feet.
I
And so
think so,
you can
yeah.
have multiple 1,200, so all of a sudden it's,
Right. Yeah, for sure.
and you can tell me to put a pin in it if this is the right place, exactly, it's just.
I don't have a good answer for you at this point.
Okay,
We've not
that's
gotten
cool.
too far into it, is the short answer. But when we looked at sizing the plant, we
Uh-huh.
have said, okay, we do have to at least think about, well, what would it look like if people in particular built by right and basically. So
Okay.
we haven't thought about that, we haven't.
So it's one of the criteria as we determine systems.
There's some sunset provisions in those laws.
So let me move forward then to what we're in right away. I kind of said this a while back when I showed you the earlier version of the slide, but Regen in particular is focused on, we just had a lot of conversation about hybrid systems and how they might work and all that sort of stuff. That's really where they're focused, but they're going to look at these other two as well. You know, what would it look like to do distributed treatment? Maybe there is a way that we can do some distributed treatment in our community. We looked at some of those systems early on.
What does that mean?
What does that mean, distributed?
So distributed treatment means, as opposed to having one central plant, for those who were around, Arenco showed us like the system that's at Dunn. You know, they have those multiple kind of, if you've been over there, I think it's called the Dantex, don't quote me on that. But, you know, is there a way to put 4 or 5 of those somewhere in the community over here, and 6 or 7 of them over there, and 3 of them over here? So you've distributed where you're doing your treatment to multiple locations in the community. So that's what distributed means. Now, is it possible? I don't know. They're going to look and kind of give us some thoughts on it. One of the struggles with that, I can say though, is if I go back to, well, I don't have it right there. If you go back to this slide, you know, other than Montanaro property, which I don't think anybody's talking about putting them there aren't a whole lot of vacant lots in our community. So you've got to come up with a place to put them. So they'll look at it though. That's part of what we've asked them to look at. So they're going to look at distributed as well as centralized. And just to be clear, so most systems that are out there today that don't have some sort of system, meaning treatment system, that don't have some sort of reuse component, stop at what we call secondary treatment. They don't treat the water to a level where it's going to get injected into the ground or where it's going to be reused. Instead, they use some sort of a settling pond to dispose it after secondary treatment. We've been looking at what's known as tertiary treatment. We take one more step, right? So initial settling, treatment, and then one more step with MDR kinds of systems to be able to create reusable water. So that's the difference that we're talking about with these two, or at least one of the differences that we're talking about these two versus MDR. It's treating it to a little less level. It might prevent, without adding some additional treatment, us from being able to do reuse. But we could send it to perk chambers. So maybe there's some savings or some way we can leverage a little less treatment, put it into the ground versus trying to reuse it as well. So they're going to look at that. We want to know what it's going to cost, right? That's part of the question. All right, so let me kind of put the slide in here so I can kind of gather everything back together because I knew we'd potentially bounce around. So from a gravity or from a collection perspective, we're really looking at 2 technologies. Traditional gravity fed, right, where everything comes out of your house, goes into a pipe, gets treated somewhere else. Effluent, which is you have a tank, it settles, we send the liquid somewhere else, and it gets treated. That tank gets pumped every 3 to 5 years. Okay, so that's on the collection side. Now, effluent kind of goes the first step of treatment as well, right? But we're looking at 2 different kinds of treatment, right? And this is really the question just a minute ago. Either centralized, meaning it all happens in one place, or distributed. We put a piece here and a piece there. Don't know what that's going to look like. As part of both the collection and the centralized treatment, one of the options, and as a homeowner here in the community, I want to know the answer to this. Well, what would it cost to send it to solving? So we're looking at that as well. Now, back to my earlier comments about the San Diego Valley Plan. Sending it to solving has some potential issues with growth inducement, particularly down the Alamo Pintado corridor. But I think it's a question we should know the answer to, right? We should know what it's going to cost. And we can figure out ways. There are technical ways. You can size a pipe that basically says, look, we're going to have X amount of effluent. We'll put a pipe in that will handle that much effluent. And that way nobody else can, you know, if it goes down Alamo Pintado, other communities can jump in. No big housing developments can just push into that pipe because there wouldn't be room. And then, so that's kind of collection, treatment, and then of course we're looking at advanced on-site. So those are sort of the mix of things we're looking at. There are some other technologies we've looked at and we continue to discuss, but this is where the big focus is or has been to date. All right, so I'll come back to some of those. I'm going to make sure I touch those. All All right, so groundwater monitoring wells. I mentioned earlier, I think I heard from the county today that our grant is approved. So we installed 2 wells back in November of last year. We took samples, and we got what was really the first solid data in 2020. Now, there has been data along the way that we've gathered up, but you know, it's not recent, and as you'll see on the next slide, it's not really consistent either. So we've got consistent solid data. We can repeat those tests, and we plan to. So for those who haven't been following this real closely, there are legal limits about the amount of nitrates. And keep in mind, every time we use the toilet, number 1, not number 2, we dispose nitrates from our body into the toilet, and it goes somewhere, either into our septic tank and into the ground, which is what most of us do, or it goes to a treatment plant, right? It's those nitrates that are really our issue. The maximum allowed level is 10 milligrams per liter. Well number 1, and I'll show you exactly where it was in just a minute, 2.6. Well number 2, right at 10. Now, interestingly, I'll show you this next slide. This is some old well data that we were able to gather. Now, here's the slide I was talking about before. You can see the kind of rust-colored outline. That is the special problems area. Our district is smaller than that, right? It kind of does this in the middle. But you can see what well tests, particularly from the 70s and 80s, and a couple into the early 2000s look like. So if it's a square box on this chart, that's a well that is deeper than 100 feet. Now that means you're kind of out of the shallow groundwater table and into deeper groundwater tables. I don't know the exact number, but our drinking water comes from about 1,000 feet. So maybe these are from some of those wells, because they seem awfully close to where some of those wells are. I don't know. Shallow wells, you notice there are no circles. Now, this was a much larger chart. I didn't want to show you all of Santa Barbara County. But there were no shallow wells in our area from this period, at least not from the data we got. And then there were other wells that nobody knew how deep they were, but they were able to get a sample. And so those are the triangles. So if you think about our district here, we can focus kind of right in here. You can see in 96, there was an unknown depth well that was okay, and it was on the west side of the creek, right? 1977, there was one that was over 100 feet deep, but it was this really rust color, so that means it's 3 times greater than the allowed levels, at least, right? So green being within limits, the kind of pinkish color being 10 to 20 mg per liter, the kind of reddish color, and then ultimately that rust. So those 77 wells in the early 80s, you can see things were really bad with those wells. So the other thing I would say about this chart is keep in mind, while it doesn't flow in a direct line, right? The general water flow in our community is from north to south, so from the top of this picture to the bottom of the picture. I'll come to that in just a second. Let me go to this one now. So here's what we're up to now. So here's where well 1 is, right at the bend of Ballard Canyon Road, right? Kind of over there. Right over by, I think it's still Refugio Ranch Winery, I'm not sure, if it's still Refugio Ranch, is well number 2. Well number 1 came in at 2.6. Well number 2, right at 10, so right at MCF, right? So the grant that we've been after is to test all these wells once they're installed, at least once. But this is where we're planning on putting in the other wells. And this will really inform that other information, right? So this is Olivet, basically going across here. So Olivet in Santa Barbara, Olivet in San Marcos for wells 3 and 4, and then well 5 somewhere down at the foot of the district. So what this will tell us is kind of what's coming into the district, what's happening through the middle of the district, to a certain level, what does it look like as we leave the district. Now, just a little bit about wells, in case you're not a well scientist. It's not that hard to envision how this works, but I'll see if I can draw it real quick for you. So if this is kind of the aerial view, right, of 4 parcels, those are 4 parcels, and I put a well right there, right in the middle of them, and my water flows this way, right, kind of north to south. When I sample that well, what am I really sampling, right? Well, it goes down, right, into the ground, but it doesn't just pick up what's right there. Think of it kind of like an inverse cone, right? It's going to pick up things that are over here that ultimately filter down and ultimately filter down. But it doesn't just do that either, right? Because I've got water flow going on at the same time. So So if I put something in there like that, I might get something that looks like this, right? I'm sorry, the other way around. This way, I'm doing it upside down. Because the water's flowing down, right? So let me change that color so it's a little clearer. I'm going to get something that might look like this. Because the water's flowing downward, and I'm sampling water at a depth, right? So it's not what's right there. It's some other shape. Now, it's not going to be a perfect oval because things don't flow perfectly, but keep in mind that when we look at wells like these, right? So if we look at well number 1, we're probably not getting stuff way down here by 1977, but we might be pulling stuff from close up here to where the 2000 is, just because it's flowing in that direction. Same with well number 2, it's right at MCL. So we know there's a lot going on right here from a commercial perspective, but presumably we were getting some stuff from north of there. We don't know how much. That's one of the beauties of putting these wells in, right? We'll be able to see what's happening as the water flows through our community. Now to your question.
So in 1977, agricultural use of nitrates was higher.
For sure.
So it makes an awful lot of sense that they have high levels.
Yep.
And since then, those of us who farm are not using those type of
Yep.
products.
Agreed.
So again, like, I'm petitioning to change the boundaries of the special problem district because I doubt, you'll find out, I'm gonna put one kind of down in the rest, but I tested my well and there is nothing.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So we'll see. Ultimately, that's what this data will tell us, is
And
what
for
we're seeing.
wineries, that was highly controlled as far as water, and they tested all the time.
There's no doubt that the fertilizer and pesticide use shifted, particularly since the 70s, right? We know that. I wouldn't dare to speak for the regulators, but I think part of what you're saying is, well, if all of these showed up at 2.6, what would they do, right?
Exactly.
Well, we know we've got 1 at 10, so that speculation kind of almost dies right there. But let's just for a second say, well, what would they do if it was 2.6? Well, I don't know the answer to that. Could we make an argument that, I'll just use the creek as a divider. If everything to the west of the creek is 2.6, can we make some sort of argument that it should be something else? Well, maybe, but then you get back to the question in the back about, okay, well, what about lot splits? And then as soon as that sort of stuff, so you get into speculation a little bit there that I think can be dangerous. So for now, we're just focused on what's in the district, right? And what are we dealing with today? And my next slide talks a little bit about this, but it's so important to get this data because it helps us make informed decisions. Right?
Are you about to cover the money for these future wells? Don't we have grants for those now?
Yeah, so these 3 wells and testing of all 5 wells is about $121,000. We've got $121,000 in grants, so it won't cost people in the room or district folks directly anything. We're getting a grant for it. That was what the board's direction was. They said, yes, we need the data, but the water board really wants us to do this. Give us some money to do it. And the water board, through County EHS, has stepped up and said, sounds like to me, based on what I heard today, here's your money, get started. And it's kind of to your question, your comment. If you look at, and it's online, you can see it, our groundwater monitoring well plan. It's based on the special problems area. So it talks about putting wells up here and wells down here and other places. May come a time where it makes sense to say, well, let's look outside the district to make sure we really understand what's going on both outside the district as well as inside the district. Other questions? This is great. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to kind of, again, I threw these slides in just to kind of pull this all back together. So that was kind of the key activities of what we've been doing this last year and where we're headed in the very near term with Regen. And the way I like to think of it is the engineering that Regen and others are doing, for instance, looking at 30% design, and I'll talk some more about that in just a second. That allows us to make both some technical comparisons as well as financial comparisons because they give us real engineering data that are based on real construction costs as opposed to just somebody sort of going off and say, well, this is what I think it'll cost. No, they spend the time to get real engineering costs at a 30% level. We know it'll change over time, but at least you've got some confidence in those numbers. So you can begin making some of those comparisons. The wells give us data on what's happening in the shallow groundwater table. That's the one that we would most directly pollute because most of our septic tanks are either on a leach field or some sort of dry well. They don't tend to go down much more than 50 to 70 feet. Some probably do, but I don't know of any. And of course, leach lines are really shallow. So when we use our septic tanks and it goes through our leach lines into the ground, that's the water table where you would see the levels of nitrates. Those two all together will be the basis for further community discussion and workshops. Our regulators will look at those. We'll then move at some point to something we call 60% design. So you kind of, this is the, think of it if you're building a house, you know, this is the rough design, right? The 30%, and then you go into the next level of design where you start actually laying out rooms and plumbing, and then you get to final design after that. And then ultimately, what we're trying to get to is a successful Proposition 218 vote by property owners. And it's important to note that's property owners, not registered voters, right? Two different groups of people. So that's who will ultimately decide, and hopefully is engaged in the conversation as we move forward. So to the 15, 30%, 60% design question that came up earlier. We're looking at getting 30% design levels because that's what we have for our gravity fed estimates. Now the zones we used for gravity fed were different, right? I showed you really 8. They only provided us 3, but we can do the math to just say, okay, well that one was there, that one's there. We can kind of do the math and make sure that all works. The best estimate on that is we're talking March, and I've got it, like I said, I've got a slide here in a minute that kind of shows that timeline at the high level. So that's sort of where that's happening. I mentioned this, but I want to make sure I touch on this one. So again, zones, whether it's the 3 we originally talked about, the 8 that we're talking about now with the hybrid, don't confuse zones with implementation phases, right? We might implement only part of what's listed as a zone. We might implement an entire zone. We might implement 3 zones. You know, if we went with effluent, it might make sense to do 3, 4, and 5 all at once. So don't confuse those two. And again, no decisions about that has been made. But that's part of what's going on with all this. We want to be able to provide that comparison. And from a financial comparison, this is purely financial. Let me be clear about this. This is not, you know, remember there were 10 things that were prioritized on that other list. Only 1 and 2 were cost, right? Things like U-shed and all those others. This is dealing with cost. So you've got capital costs and O&M costs. So what people said was most important to them and what they said was second most important. These are the numbers we've gathered thus far, and we're trying to fill the rest of this in. And that's really the short-term goal. So we know what a gravity-fed collection and gravity-fed collection to MBR treatment looks like. That's that roughly $50 million that I was talking about earlier, those two together. We know what the O&M for that is. We talked about the fact that a year ago we got estimates from engineers on percolation chambers, a little over $1 million to build them, and they said it's basically minimal. You don't have to do a whole lot once they're installed. Perk ponds, about $400,000 less. Both of those are millions of dollars cheaper than the other options. So we've got Regen looking at this, and these two, myself and our engineer, in fact I'm meeting with Solvang tomorrow again to talk to them about what that might look like and get their side of the story. They have made it clear thus far that they're just interested in having a conversation with us. They have the capacity. One of the beauties of Solvang, of course, we don't have to put anything in, right, other than pipes, which wouldn't be all bad. I'm setting aside the potential issues, Alamo Potato Corridor, all of that for just a minute, but at least from a district perspective, in some ways it's easier. In advanced onsite, again, we've heard other numbers. I've heard numbers much higher than 100,000, but those are the numbers that we got from EHS. And to the earlier question, you know, if we start heading down a large zone 6, I think we're going to re-verify those numbers with an actual vendor and say, okay, let's make sure that what we're telling people is absolutely correct. So that's what a financial comparison, remember I said the engineering side will give us this. The rest of it, as far as, you know, some of the other factors that people would consider a little more difficult to do. But I'm sure that between the rubric that Regen put together originally and some other things that we can look at kind of some of those weights about, well, you know, the plant size or the sounds or the smells or whatever, now that I see what's really going on, that's more important, and we can play around with that in some way. All right, so this is kind of the cost estimates one. I spoke about commercial versus non-commercial. We can do just the commercial zone if we decided to. That's we have to have a plan for everything, but we could start certainly with the commercial zone. Donated land, again, I mentioned we don't have any. At this point, we have some discussions that we could potentially get the parcel from the county by the church, but that's really all that's out there. When will it be built? I'm going to talk about that one on this next slide. Restrooms. So the district right now hasn't spent a whole lot of time talking about restrooms, right? I know that in particular the commercial core would love to see restrooms. I know I've heard from residential folks that say, well, I wouldn't use it, why would I pay for it? So that's going to be an interesting discussion, right? It might be that somebody says, well, I'll give you the land and, you know, or whatever. I don't know how that's going to work. It's clear that as we operate today, there's a need for a restroom because businesses downtown in particular can't really allow people to use their restrooms. So that puts a pinch on community. I mean, if you go to St. Mark's, which has kind of become the de facto community restroom, I don't know how their system's still working because it's used a lot, but particularly on weekends. But yeah, I think it's a great conversation to figure out what are we going to do for restrooms. Now, once you have a sewer, presumably then the wine tasting places can allow people to use their bathrooms. Maybe the need for a restroom in a community our size goes down. I don't know. I think it'll be an interesting discussion when we get there. All right, so I've talked about kind of where we were and the things that are going on right now. So I put together this sort of rough slide, and it's not intended to be exhaustive. It's really intended to just kind of hit the high level, couple of things that I think, or I thought people might want to know. So through roughly March, we're going to be looking at, you know, Regen's going to be giving us some information. I've got kind of an initial suggestion from Solvang. We'll hear from them, get some information from them. So we'll be able to put together what might be a complete cost comparison early next year, before the spring, which I think would be great. Once we've got that to me is when I'll be, and I'm sure the board will be open to it, but I'll really be pushing on the board, okay, it's time to get some workshops going, because people need to see this data, they need to have a chance to talk about it in a room like this and say, what does that mean? How does that work? What is it, you know, and just kind of ask all those questions. At the same time, we're going to be talking about some of these other questions, like where might this thing go, right? If we know how much flow there is and we know what technology we think we're going to use, well, now you can talk about what treatment might look like, right? And Regen's doing some of that work for us. But ultimately, if we put a site in our community, you've got to pick that site, right? So I expect that that'll be kind of spring, early summer that we'll begin those conversations. That, to me, in my experience with other systems that have gone in, is probably the hardest conversation you have, right? As much as people want to talk about their own site and what's happening on their parcel, as soon as whoever it is, something is going to be put anywhere near them, you have sound conversations and odors and, you know, all these other conversations. And those tend to be the most interesting ones, and people get really, really animated. And understandably, I think, you know, all of us understand why that would be, you know. After we get through those, we'll start working on both environmental review and something called 60% design, again, kind of taking the design to the next level, getting even better costs, and then ultimately, somewhere maybe 24, 25, I'm not even putting a timeline on it, no, I said something to change, we'll get to a Proposition 218 vote. Now, LAFCO wants to see us do it before we come back to them on our 2-year cycle. If you read the latest quarterly newsletter, I said, I don't think that's going to happen, just because of what we've got in front of us. Now, taking you back to like the third slide, you know, at $250,000, just one of these studies could cost $250,000. If you talk about doing the 60% engineering design, the 30% that Stantec did was more than our annual budget. We got some grants to help us along with that, so we've got to come up with a way, and we have a grant subcommittee who's looking at this, but we've got to come up with a way to be able to finance all this, right? And that could really slow some things down in this area. So if we don't have money to pay for a study or design, how do we do it? All right, so this then leads us to when will it be built? So if you assume that, you know, you've got 60% design, you're ready to take that to final design, and you've got a successful Prop 218 vote, that being a critical juncture, you're probably 18 months to 2 years by the time you get final docs and actually turn a shovel of dirt. So it's a little ways out. It's not going to happen. You know, again, I mentioned earlier we've got a business with the failing septic system. We're going to have to come up with a solution for them much sooner than, you know, they can't wait till 26, 27 kind of a thing. So that's that one. Talked about that, covered that some. Commercial, donated land, options, some of the pros and cons. We can talk some more about that in recipes. All right, so that's sort of my last sort of slide. I think everybody in this room is probably already signed up with this, but if not, and you want to get email notifications, please make sure that you go to our subscribe page and we'll get those out to you. You can send me an email directly or call the district phone line. And with that, what other questions did you have or do you have?
So going back to the cost,
Yes.
alluding to what each of us might pay
Yes.
or be assessed or be put on a property tax bill. So in the step or the effluent, they're fairly cookie cutter in a way. We have a tank that goes down, and a pipe that comes out through the pipe. So the on-site work should be relatively consistent in the parcels in that red area on there. So is that the cost then that could be put onto my property tax bill, so I'm not having to write a big old check that gets amortized over time, then I just have a monthly subscription, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think the question is, you know, what's that number going to look like? And yes, you know, if I go back to that, you know, zones 3, 4, and 5 are affluent. Yeah, there's one cost to do that. There might be a different cost for the gravity fed folks, right? And you know, you're a financial guy. You can think through this for us as well. But there is some debate in my mind. Nobody's really taken it too far, but there is some debate in my mind about, well, how much of that is easier from a costing perspective as well as an implementation perspective to just say, you know, we're going to treat them all the same, regardless of what technology they're on, versus saying, your gravity, you're going to be treated like this, we're going to charge you this, versus your effluent, you're going to be treated like this and cost like this. I don't know how that's going to work. I think we're going to have to look at the financial models and see if there's really that big of a difference. I don't know how much difference there will be. We had some early estimates just from a vendor that said it might be as much as $10 million cheaper if we all were on effluent. I don't know how that shakes out when if you have some parcels that have to be on gravity. I don't know how that all shakes out. So there's an interesting discussion to be had there. Now, to your point though, ultimately, we're going to come up with a number that's the total number, right? And all you can do today, and what the early assessment engineer, you hire what's known as an assessment engineer. The assessment engineer looks at different factors and says, okay, how do we take this number and allocate it, right? Now, for their initial models, they loaded all the parcels, they did all that sort of stuff, they loaded the parcel size, and they used parcel size as a kind of a surrogate to say, well, if you just did it on parcel size, because parcel size kind of gives you a sense of potential, if I can use that word, meaning, you know, if I have a very large lot, I have the potential to either develop it some other way, split it up, or have a large house. If I have a very small lot, there's only so many things I can do with that, right? So as a kind of a surrogate, they use that potential number to say, okay, if you use just square footage of your lot, not of your home, of your lot, regardless of what type of zoning you had, this is what it might look like. Now, I don't think that's what the board will go forward with based on comments they've made publicly. Instead, you know, for instance, if you're zoned commercial, you'd probably be paying a little more than you are if you're residential, because your usage is different. So you'd be paying a little different amount for capital cost, as well as certainly when it comes to monthly O&M costs, right? Because if you're a heavy user and you're using the system more often, you should be paying more, right? That's just how those things tend to work. So we don't know what it's going to look like at this point, but you can see some of the issues that kind of swirl around costs and how you allocate those costs. But ultimately, yeah, I suspect that we'll be looking hard at grants, and grants will help us decide what zone we're gonna, or what zone we're gonna implement in what phase, right? If we get, somebody walks by tomorrow and says, here's $50 million, right? We'd probably say, well, let's just do a gravity fed, we're done with it, right? Nobody's gonna do that. If they came by and just said, well, here's enough for you to do the commercial zone, we'd probably do that, right? Because if you implement even one area, you have to have a treatment plant to treat the effluent, right? And you're probably not gonna size a treatment plant done with it, right? Nobody's gonna do that. If they came by and just said, well, here's enough for you to do the commercial zone, we'd probably do that, right? Because if you implement even one area, you have to have a treatment plant to treat the effluent, right? And you're probably not gonna size a treatment plant for just the commercial zone. It's gonna have a little extra capacity because there's homes in and around there and that sort of stuff. So I think it's really interesting if you're particularly into finances we've got some work to do there for sure. Figure out how we allocate those funds, what's fair, what's right, and so on. More than you wanted, but
I have a large lot of tiny house, so I'm screwed. What happens if the voters don't pass this?
yeah, so what happens if voters don't pass this? Well, there's two things that can happen.
Property owners, yes.
You end up, yeah, property owners, yeah. Often, if it fails, people try again. Maybe you change how something can be done, to your earlier comment about, well, what about those lots in zone 6? Maybe enough of them wanted to be effluent as opposed to on-site. If you change those into effluents, or maybe they vote for it then, right? And there's a whole process that we'll go through for polling and that sort of stuff to see what people want. But yeah, so to directly answer your question, take it out for a vote. If it doesn't work the first time, most likely you'll see a second round at it. I'd rather, see it happen the first time because we've done polling and make sure we're doing what people want the first time, right? If you get through a second time and you're headed to a third time, not looking good, right? And I hate to see this happen, but that means it could end up back at the county. Now, if that happens, in my opinion, they can leverage all the really good work we've done. So that's good. But I don't want to just hand it to the county, and I'm an old county guy, so.
Would the county end up paying for it then?
No.
No.
Nice try.
Yeah. No, my experience is that, the costs definitely don't go down in the interim, and the homeowner still pays for it.
Is San Ynez in the solving, is San Ynez sewer in the solving system?
Is San Ynez sewer in the solving system?
Is San Ynez
CSD.
treatment?
So they do collection and treatment, yeah. Is that, I'm not sure I know.
Are they in the solving or
No,
separate?
they're separate.
We don't talk to them either? Or-
We have. They don't have capacity and they've got their own things going on. That was one of the areas that they talked about before the district was formed, was connecting Los Olivos to San Ynez. All sorts of issues with that.
Thanks, guys. Great.
Other
Thank you very
questions?
much.
Great job.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you guys for coming in. Your questions are good for me to have kind of this interaction. This is recorded, so that's good. That means board members that weren't able to attend tonight will be able to hear the conversation, so they'll be able to understand the questions that are on your minds. It's also being recorded independently. I think it ends up on YouTube or somewhere. So again, thank you for coming.